Welcome to Truths Jewish Business Day. Thank you so much for joining. If you like this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, whatever it is. Leave a review, like it. That helps other people find it. Okay, now we got that out of the way. Let's jump right in. This is the Torah portion, uncensored part of the podcast. And we're going to talk about the parsha of Shlach. I have a guest with me, Yehudah Ber Zerkind, who we're going to talk about the parsha with. I want to focus on the story of the Makoshesh Eitzim, which is the story which is found. This fellow is walking around and he's collecting these pieces of wood, sticks of wood, on Shabbos. And people find him and they say, "What are you doing on Shabbos?" And they don't know what to do with him. And eventually they find out what to do with him and they stone him to death. So they kill him for collecting this wood on Shabbos. That is a story which is found in the Torah portion of Shlach. There's actually a similar story which is found in the Torah portion of Emor in Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which is of a person who ends up cursing God's name or using God's name to curse. He is also he is stoned, but similar kind of story. They don't know what to do with him. And then they ask God and they find out what to do with him. And the punishment he gets is stoning. So both of these stories, they're told and they're kind of out of place. They're all of a sudden like dumped in the middle of some other things which are going on. In this week's Torah portion, there are around the story of the Meraglim, of the spies. And right before this story, there is a conversation regarding the different offerings that you could bring up in order to gain atonement for sins which you did either unwittingly or wittingly. And in the story of the Makalel, the person who curses God, it talks about lechem apanim, or the showbread, which is brought in the temple or the tabernacle. So there are a bunch of different questions which I want to bring up here, Yehudah Ber, which I know you have some views on and which you have studied as well. So first of all, why do these stories appear here in this kind of sequence? But furthermore, what's really interesting to me, I find like it's compounded, this question, by the idea that right before the story of the Makalel, it talks about the lechem apanim, which is on Shabbos. Actually says it outright that this lechem apanim is arranged on Shabbos. Then it goes into the story of the Makalel, of the person who curses God, which has got nothing to do with Shabbos. And ironically, in Shlach, it talks about Megadif, which is blasphemy. And then you would think, okay, it's talking about blasphemy. If it's going to use any of these stories, it should use the story of blasphemy. And instead, it uses the story of the person who collects wood. So it seems like they're out of place. In other words, the story of the Makalel should be where the story of the Makoshesh is, because we just spoke about blasphemy. Okay, now bring a story of someone who blasphemed. And the other one just spoke about Shabbos, the showbread, which was something which was done on Shabbos. Then it should talk about, if it's going to talk about anything, it should talk about the story of the Makoshesh, the person who was collecting the wood on Shabbos. And it seems like the opposite. So there's something going on here in the text, which I find really interesting. There are a bunch of other things which I find interesting, which we can talk about. But what's your take on all of this?
Okay, thanks, Levi, for those introductory thoughts. It was a pleasure to be with you to talk about the Parsha. Actually, a number of weeks ago, I reflected on this particular Parsha when I was studying the broader themes of Vayikra and Bamidbar. And I was really struck by the question of how come the stories of the Makalel and the Makoshesh seem to be out of place. I'll just get straight to it, and I'll tell you that I think that your question is really the answer. In other words, your question of how come in this week's Parsha where we mention Megadef, and then it talks about Shabbos, whereas in Parshas Emor it talks about Shabbos, and then we start mentioning the Makalel, that is actually the answer. And to put it very briefly, to start with the punchline first, I think this is intentional. I think the Torah is telling us something by juxtaposition. In other words, the fact that the Torah is juxtaposing Shabbos and the Makalel and the blasphemer, in both situations is an indication that the Torah regards both sins to be similar, of a similar nature. And it is essentially the juxtaposition that the Torah is after. In other words, the Torah knows that there's both of these stories and that both of these stories have to come somewhere in the text. The question is where to put them. If the Torah would have put the Makalel and Shabbos and the Makoshesh in sequence, then you wouldn't learn about the comparison, that we're comparing Shabbos to a Makalel. And I think that that is a very important message that the Torah is trying to impart to us. That, for example, if we look in this week's Parsha, which you mentioned earlier, where we talk about sins and what happens when somebody unwittingly commits a sin. So the Torah talks about different procedures for atonement, bringing a korban, and it talks about different contingencies, different details, whether it's a communal sin of omission or an individual sin of omission. And then if I may for a minute, highlight some of the wording of the pasuk. Is that okay to highlight something?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So in that particular case of doing something b'shoigeg, unwittingly, non-intentionally. So the Torah discusses, for example, in this week's Parsha, Perek Tezvav, Pasuk Chav Zayin, Ve'im nefesh achas techta b'shgaga, ve'kriva eiz bashnasa l'chatos. That if a one person sins unwittingly, and it has to bring a certain sacrifice, and then the Torah continues that the Kohen atones for this particular person who has sinned b'shoigeg, unwittingly, unintentionally. It wasn't done as a brazen act, an intentional act. And but the Torah continues in Pasuk Lamed, V'hanefesh asher tasem b'yad rama mina ezrach mina. A person who will do something brazenly, defiantly, in full display, whether that person is an ezrach, a citizen of the land of Israel, or a foreigner. In other words, somebody who doesn't own land in Israel, but is considered a resident alien. That's the simple understanding of the difference between an ezrach and a ger. Like you have in America, the difference between somebody with a passport and a green card, a citizen and a resident alien. Es Hashem hu megadeh, he is cursing, he is blaspheming God. Note the language here, it's unequivocal. Es Hashem hu megadeh, he is cursing God. And that person will be excised from his people. And right afterwards, the Torah says, after one pasuk, which elaborates on this theme, it talks about the Makoshesh, the one who's gathering wood on Shabbos. Now, I think, based on what other commentaries state, that the reason for the juxtaposition between these two laws is because the Makoshesh was an example of somebody who did something defiantly. It wasn't somebody who was an ignorant person who didn't know that you're not allowed to gather wood on Shabbos. No, we're talking about somebody who made a deliberate point of going out in public display defiantly to collect wood. And therefore, it is an example of this situation of somebody who does something biyad rama. But what I find here so intriguing is that not only does the Torah mention biyad rama, that he's doing something defiantly, brazenly, the Torah also mentions that he is cursing Hashem, which to me is an indication that the Torah regards somebody who desecrates the Shabbos as a blasphemer, equivalent to somebody who's cursing Hashem. That's just my thought about it.
And then going back to Emor, the same thing, right? But reversed.
Right, because if you go back to Emor, right before the case of the Makalel, we talk about Shabbos. It talks about the Lechem Apanim. It mentions B'yoyim HaShabbos.
It says B'yoyim HaShabbos twice.
B'yoyim HaShabbos, B'yoyim HaShabbos. And then right afterwards, in the next pasuk, it talks about that the Israelite, Vayetzi ben Isha Yisraelis, V'hu ben Ish Mitzri, and pasuk Yud, Vayikoy ben ha'isha Yisraelis as Hashem Vayikalel. That the son of the Israelite woman, he blasphemed or cursed the name of God. So you see, right away, right after Yom HaShabbos, we go to the Makalel. Just like over here in Parsha Shlach, we mention as Hashem Hu Megadeh. And right away, we get into the story of the Makoshesh.
Very interesting. There are a few other interesting things which I found here in this text, which I'd love you to comment on. Often when I'll sit down and I'll learn a parsha, I'll come up with some kind of wisdom which it seems the parsha is trying to tell us. Whether this is what the parsha is actually trying to tell us or not, I don't know. But al pi adrush, at least, I find some value out of it. So I'm stumped by some of this, to be frank. Let me tell you what else I found interesting here. Is that if you look in Parshas Emor, you find in the preamble, I'm going to call it the preamble to these stories, because the story of the Lechem Aponim, I see as like the preamble to the story of the Makalel, and the story about the person who sins, etc., B'yad Rama, that's like the preamble to the story of the Makoshesh. So in the preamble, I find that you have these two themes, if you like. One theme is the idea that you've got this generality that it involves and is inclusive of all the children of Israel. And in the case of the Makoshesh, it's not just all the children of Israel. It talks about the chiper, hakoyin ala nefesh hashegeges, b'chet b'shkoga lefnei Hashem lechaper v'nisach le ezach b'vnei Yisrael v'lager hagro b'sichem Torah achas yiyeh lachem la'oise b'shkoga. It's one Torah for all the people, no matter what. If your iniquities are done unintentionally, then it's one Torah. And if you look at the preamble to the story of the Makalel, you have a similar type of thing where it says, B'yom Shabbos, Yerchenu lifnei Hashem, Tamid mi'es b'nei Yisrael bris olam. This isn't just from the Kohanim. It's not just this, although this is done by the priests, it's from the children of Israel. It's from everyone. And then it says, so in other words, I see that similarity. But then even more striking, you find this idea of bris olam. It says it should be an everlasting covenant in the preamble to the Makalel, and the preamble to the Makoshesh, it talks about which is the opposite. It's like the inverse. So one is talking about a bris olam, and the other one's talking about so one's talking about an everlasting covenant. This is something which, through having this showcase, the Lechem Aponim, you end up with a bris olam, everlasting covenant, and then when you have a person doing a sin intentionally, then it's totally cut off. There's juxtaposition between these ideas I find very interesting. What did you think the text is trying to convey? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know we didn't discuss this previously. I'm springing this on you.
Well, I would have to look more, and I thank you for your comparison, but just, like some random thoughts that come out to me right now is the very strong connection between the notion of bris and kares. For example, we find that in Lech Lecha, in Bereshit Zion, where in the case of Milah, it says very clearly. I think that's the first case in the Torah where it says explicitly. Let me try to get the text here where it says, "Zois brisi asher tishmeru." This is in Bereshit Perek Zion pasuk Yud. Asher tishmeru beini ubeinechem himo lechem kol zachar. V'arol zachar asher lo yimoy les besara losai v'nichresa hanefesh ahi me'ameha as berisi heifar.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you look in this week's parsha, and Parsha Shlach, it also mentions similar language of revoking. It doesn't say as berisi heifar, but it uses the language of as mitzvosei heifar. Hikares.
Yep.
It's very, very similar language, because you revoke the mitzvah or the covenant of God. The way I see it in a nutshell.
So the preamble, what I think in the preamble to these two stories, the theme is similar. Maybe one's inverse of the other, but the idea, and you've pointed out by that bringing up the pasuk in Bereshis about a bris, that basically it is used interchangeably in a way. Would that be correct? Bris and kares, the two sides of the same coin.
I definitely think so. I mean, kares exists in the Torah for many different sins.
Right.
Now, what's interesting
is kares, it's a type of abnegation of the bris, right? In some sense, the covenant is there. You've done something which has now damage that covenant, and therefore the result is kares.
I think that would be correct. I think there's idea of that the bris is both vertical and horizontal, meaning it's both a connection between you and God, and one in God and one in the people. So in order to be part of the Israelite community and connected to God, one needs to keep the bris. If they don't keep the bris, then there's a problem. I'll just point out that usually kares is for negative sin. If somebody serves idols or does other averas, so there are many cases of kares in the Torah.
Yeah.
It's unusual for there to be kares for a positive commandment.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have it, for example, in the case of Mila and also the Korban Pesach. The Torah says, "Va'isha shehu." This is Bamidbar test. "Va'isha shehu Torah v'derech lo'haya v'choda lasais Pesach v'nichresa hanefesh shehi me'amel ki Korban Hashem lo'hikra v'moyadai." In other words, although I would say that I would need to do more research on this particular topic, it appears to me that those particular mitzvahs aseh, positive commandments, for which not doing them, with a sin of omission rather than a sin of commission, invokes the kares penalty, has to do with those mitzvahs specifically that are crucial to the covenant. Pesach is the formation of the Jewish people. Pesach is that moment where God makes the Jews into a nation. Shabbos is B'Shomru B'nei Yisrael, so Shabbos, Lasses L'Shabbos, D'Reisam, B'ris Olam. We say that every week in Kiddush. So if somebody revokes that covenant, that is reason for this punishment. I would even add just one quick point, that without getting into the specifics of the different death penalties in the Torah, and the whole discussion of the death penalty in the Torah is a whole huge discussion, which we're not going to get into right now. We know that in Chazal, we have 4 types of death penalties. There's a skila, sreifa, henek, and chenek, which means stoning, burning, there's decapitation by sword, and then there's strangulation. But over here we see that the Torah talks about a skila, which is stoning. And it appears to me that from all the punishments of the Torah, skila is a mob death.
Yeah.
Skila is a mob death, meaning even though that in Chazal and the Mishnah we find that skila is just essentially one person throws a person down from a very tall story, from a very high building, and you throw that person down to the death. In the Pshutei Shel Mikra, without getting into how to reconcile it with Chazal, it seems clear that skila meant that it was a mob death.
Yeah.
People ganged up on the person and killed him. You find this with the Makalel and with the Makoshesh. The whole Ada comes together and they stone the person. You find this also in Ben Saira, Meira, and other examples. I feel that essentially what's going on here, these are sins, either you can call them high treason, a treacherous act, or an act which is so anathema to the society at whole. It invokes such an outrage, not only among the rabbis or the legalists, but among the people. It is considered such a person, you deserve to be stoned. And it is meant to bring out that outrage. That's why you find, for example, by Avodah Zarah, everybody stones them. In other words, this is supposed to be a communal act. This is a communal purge. You're getting the whole community riled up against the person because what you did is so egregious that you cannot live anymore. We need to purge you from the machana. And I think that is also in terms of Levi, your wisdom. We don't use the death penalty today in the Torah for Makalel Shabbos. And I don't want to see return to it. But I think the wisdom.
Are you sure?
I was actually thinking about it in light of your truth, like trying to extract what is the wisdom behind the parsha. And I think part of the wisdom is there are certain things that even if we're not going to take them literally today in a halakhic way, we're not going to be Iran or Saudi Arabia or other countries where these things are done literally, but there's a concept, there's a truth behind it. The truth behind it is that there are certain core principles or ideas or institutions which are so deeply part of the fabric of the formation of the constitution of a people that somebody who violates them is considered, you've outed yourself. You've taken yourself away from the camp, and and one has committed an act of treason by doing that. Now, and I think Shabbos again, today there are many Jews that don't observe Shabbos. So today there's a whole halachic discussion, and many halachic authorities say that the whole status of Shmir Shabbos is different. But in the times of the Torah, when everyone was observing Shabbos, that was seen as such an essential element that somebody who didn't keep Shabbos, it was a greater statement. It was a greater statement that I don't care to be a traitor. I don't care to do something in defiance of the entire ethos of the community.
The way I've always thought about this, and these stories have never really bothered me, like from a rationalistic perspective, because the way I've always thought about this is that it actually makes perfect sense. If you're not trying to herd cats, you got all the Israelites coming from Egypt, and you're trying to fashion a radically new society, which has certain fundamentals to it. If you don't have very strict rules and consequences for people who break those rules and immediate consequences, then it's just going to be a free-for-all and everyone's just going to do what they want. And in that case, you just are not going to be able to fashion this radically new society. If you have real values, you have to be able to enforce those values, or else you're just never going to be able to create a society based on those values. And when I think about the Torah, especially the Chamusha Torah and the Israelites in the desert, I very much think about starting a new business. And I think about it in very similar terms. Moshe Rabbeinu was starting this new enterprise. And how do you have a successful enterprise? If you start a business and you say, you know what, I'm not sure I really have a mission statement, and we're going to allow our employees to do whatever they want, and you're just never going to have a business. You need to have some very strong values, a mission statement, who you are, where you're going, what you're going to do, and then you need to be able to enforce that upon people, or else you don't end up with a culture, you don't end up with a business. So, and you need strong leadership. So I see this as a lot of these things as lessons of how do you start an enterprise. And sometimes there needs to be consequences for people get fired sometimes. We had the debate last night, and Donald Trump turned to Biden and says, you don't fire anyone. It's not that it's fun to fire people, but sometimes you got to fire people. And, Trump's known for firing people. You're fired. But the idea here is that sometimes there are things that people do which are egregious, and you need to create consequences around it, or else you can't actually create change.
I really appreciate what you're saying. And I also want to highlight your point and bring it back to the Parsha, like the wisdom and the wisdom that we can extract from the Torah and actually learning the Torah itself. So one of the other things that I noticed about the stoning, like we have here in the case of the Makoshesh, is that first of all, the whole section, this Torah is talking about rebellion. Shlach is a major rebellion. Korach is a major rebellion.
Yeah, next week.
And sandwiched in between these two rebellions is a halacha about a rebel, about a Makoshesh on Shabbos. That is number one. But number two, even more specifically, earlier on in Midbar Yudalid, in this week's Parsha, in Parsha Shlach, in Pasuk Yud, it says, "Vayoimru kala eda lirgoim oisam ba'avonim." We have stoning in the Parsha right before us. The whole Ada, the whole congregation was going to stone Moshe and Aaron. In other words, we're talking a situation where the whole nation became kind of biadrama, going against Hashem, if we think of it in terms of our Parsha. And I think it's interesting, this juxtaposition of, in the earlier Parsha, it was the people who were going to stone Moshe and Aaron. And here, in a certain sense, maybe there's a positive reversal, where it is the whole community who is stoning the sinner, not Moshe and Aaron. Here they're following Hashem. They're not going against Hashem. So even though Chazal say, there is a tradition within Chazal that the Makoshesh meant l'shem shamayim. The Makoshesh meant had a good intention. And perhaps one of the ways of looking at it is what I just said now, that he was the rebel, and he appeared to be a rebel, and he did it defiantly. But maybe that person just wanted to figure out, oh no, I'm going to do something which is going to incur the public wrath against me, and I'm going to show through that the people are really deep down loyal to God. So yeah, it's about loyalty, it's about treason, it's about commitment. That's what I see what these parshiyos are all about.
And Rashi says, Pasuk Lamed Beis, that this was the second Shabbos. And it was the first one, everyone kept no problem. The second one, people were like, all right, we won't do this again. And so they had to put their foot down and say, no, we're going to do this every week. This is now a new thing. The other thing which I found really interesting, and I wonder what you think about this, which is if you look at the Makalel and the Makoshesh, so in the Makalel, you have first, if you like, the results of a mitzvahs aseh, which is challah, right? So the showbread. The results of that is this covenant. Then you have the whole story of the person who blasphemed, the person who cursed. And then afterwards, you have a mitzvahs loisaseh, ish kiyake, or at least the results of a person who hits his friend, the results of a person contravening a mitzvahs loisaseh. You're not allowed to hit your friend. He hits his friend, and what happens? There's an eye for an eye, etc. Then the Makoshesh, you have it reversed. You have the results of a loisaseh, which is kares. So the person sinned, intentionally sinned, and you get cut off. Then you have the story of the Makoshesh, and then you have a mitzvah aseh. You have tzitzis. You have a positive commandment. So I just found this interesting that there is this sequence of the stories, but one has it one way and the other one has it somewhat reversed. So in the Makalel, you have positive commandment, story of the Makalel, and then a negative. So positive, the story, and then the negative. And here you have a negative, the story, and then a positive.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I'm not sure what this is one of the things, like I said, usually I have some kind of wisdom or something to say about it. I just noticed this, but I don't have an idea of what this is trying to tell us or any wisdom behind it. But as I was learning this, I noticed this and I thought it was an interesting observation.
Can I just share one small thought about it? Okay. So just very briefly, I want to point out that if you look at the sequence of the Parsha, and you mentioned their Parsha Tzitzis following, what do we have there? It says, Re'isim oisei is a chartem is called mitzvahs Hashem, that you should remember all the mitzvahs of Hashem. Yeah. And then earlier in that law that you're talking about of sins of omission or commission, there's also similar language where the Torah says, "V'loi sasu es kol ha-mitzvahs ha'ela asher dibra Hashem el Moshe." It uses a very similar language, kol mitzvahs Hashem. The concept of kol asher dibra Hashem aleichem. In Pasuk Chav Beis and Chav Gimel. In Pasuk in Perek Tezvav.
Okay, of Bamidbar. Yeah.
In this parak that we're focusing on, Perek Tezvav, in Pasuk Chav Beis, it says, "V'chisish gubulei sasu of kol ha-mitzvahs ha'ela asher dibra Hashem el Moshe. It's kol asher tziva Hashem aleichem b'yad Moshe." So I saw an article by somebody called Rabbi Avram Shammai. He teaches in the yeshiva of Gush Etzion, Yeshivat Har Etzion. So he points out the linguistic juxtaposition between those verses and the following mitzvah of tzitzis, or the Isamai the chartem is called mitzvah Hashem. So it appears to me, I would generalize it more, that the case of the Makoshesh is an extreme example of obedience of all the mitzvahs of Hashem. Because essentially what the Torah says earlier, somebody biyad Rama violates any of the mitzvahs of Hashem, then they have kares. The case of the Makoshesh of stoning is the most extreme example, but it's only a prat. So I would see here in a certain sense, as we yeshiva bakar or people that learn yeshiva, there's klal or prat or klal.
Yeah.
We first have the klal about all the mitzvahs Hashem, about omission. We have the prat about Shabbos, about the Makoshesh. Then we go back to the klal again of the Isam Oisei Zachartem as Kol Mitzvahs Hashem. That's my 2 cents about it.
That's interesting. So that sequence seems to make sense in terms of here's the general and the results of what happens if a person doesn't follow those things. Either he has to bring a carbon or, he's doomed. Then an example of it, and then some kind of safeguard, have tzitzis, so you remember all the mitzvahs of Hashem.
Exactly. That you shouldn't be milim, exactly, because earlier it says, what happens if you forget? That's exactly the point. The lashon over here is the ime'eda, me'eda nesalishgag or stuff like that. There was a helen, there was a forgetting. But here is, in order to avert that, or the opposite of that is the mitzvah sisters, which is or Hashem.
But the other thought which I had about this was that whenever any good teacher is going to give a practical, very tangible example of something. So these stories, whether it's the Makalel, it's a whole story of an individual. It's not a story of, as you mentioned earlier, it's not the story of the people. It's a story of an individual. What can happen if a person ends up doing something which they shouldn't do? And it tells a story in detail of what happens. And the result is not pretty. So this example, bringing it home to the reader of what actually can happen, is any good teacher is the way they would teach. And the Torah obviously is an amazing teacher. Torah, Melashon Hara, it's actually supposed to teach you something. So it actually teaches you also how to teach. If you're teaching, you want to give a solid example, practical, as graphic as possible, of the results of what can happen.
Right. There's a didactic element. Very well put. That's a great observation.
So I'm very grateful for you sharing your insights here. Usually on this podcast, it's just me sitting here. And obviously for me, it's not as enjoyable just sitting here talking as it is discussing with somebody else. So we were texting backwards and forwards this week about the parsha, and you gave some wonderful insights, and very grateful for that. So I said, why don't you just come on and we just discuss it, which for me is much more pleasurable than me just sitting in front of a microphone doing a monologue. So I'm grateful for that as well. For the audience, I'm sure they also are going to enjoy this more than just my monologue. Overall, thank you very, very much for being in. I know you're in Jerusalem. It's Erev Shabbos right now, so it's quite a bit later. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the great dialogue and great conversation.